John Ellis Gore, Sr.
Thanks be to God.
Kenneth Causey.
Thanks be to God. Rennie Matthews. Thanks be to God. Xavier Causey. Thanks be to God.
Matthew Rankin.
Thanks be to God.
Carrie Smith Stagg.
Thanks be to God. Dorothy Ivy Carpenter. Thanks be to God. Dr. Wilbur Carpenter. Thanks be to God. Don Carpenter. Thanks be to God.
Bertha Jenkins.
Thanks be to God.
Flora Harrison.
Thanks be to God.
L.R. Mashburn.
Thanks be to God.
Louise Richardson.
Thanks be to God.
Dorothy Johnson.
Thanks be to God.
Maddie Cooper.
Thanks be to God.
Kay Sheffield.
Thanks be to God.
Robert Shoemaker.
Thanks be to God.
Gwen Lell.
Thanks be to God.
Phyllis Seal.
Thanks be to God.
Linda Shoemaker Cook.
Thanks be to God.
Joe Hess.
Thanks be to God.
Helen Franklin.
Thanks be to God.
Richard Ritchie.
Thanks be to God.
Clayton Powers.
Thanks be to God.
Dick Brogan.
Thanks be to God.
Tricia Wilson.
Thanks be to God.
Grace Gober.
Thanks be to God.
Luna Gatewood.
Thanks be to God.
Bill Strum.
Thanks be to God.
Dorothy Dot Ponder Layton.
Thanks be to God.
J. Clark Hensley.
Thanks be to God.
Margaret Sipes Hensley.
Thanks be to God.
Dolly Legg.
Thanks be to God.
Charles Legg.
Thanks be to God.
Wilma Cooper.
Thanks be to God.
Thelma Mildred Basley.
Thanks be to God.
Cecil Brinson.
Thanks be to God.
Peggy Lundmark.
Thanks be to God.
Sue Dennis Riley.
Thanks be to God.
Martha Ballard Rushing.
Thanks be to God.
Clyde Hemphill.
Thanks be to God.
Faye Patterson.
Thanks be to God.
Francis McKee.
Thanks be to God.
Arbilla Billy Langston.
Thanks be to God.
Barbara. Thanks be to God.
Jim Street.
Thanks be to God.
Joanne L. Edwards.
Thanks be to God.
Gary Green. Thanks be to God. Edna Brock Ferguson. Thanks be to God. Clifton C. Ferguson, Jr. Thanks be to God. Elizabeth Marie Mosley. Thanks be to God. Roy Ray. Thanks be to God. Christola Sawyer Ray. Thanks be to God. James D. Green. Thanks be to God. Faye Lowry Green. Thanks be to God. Doreen Ferguson Bush. Thanks be to God. David James Green. Thanks be to God. David Cobb. Thanks be to God.
Itasca Boyd Hudson Wood. Thanks be to God.
Charles Roland Jones.
Thanks be to God. Reverend William Watson. Thanks be to God.
Dr. Norman O'Neill.
Thanks be to God. Audra O'Neill. Thanks be to God.
Bill Hodge.
Thanks be to God. June Hodge. Thanks be to God.
Joe Smith Holman.
Thanks be to God. Harold Holman. Thanks be to God.
M.L. Griffin. Thanks be to God. Hazel Griffin. Thanks be to God.
Cynthia Smith Stringer. Thanks be to God. Chuck Smith. Thanks be to God. Robert Smith. Thanks be to God.
Dorothy Palmer. Thanks be to God.
Carol Morale. Thanks be to God. George Barnes. Thanks be to God. Theron Crockett. Thanks be to God.
Emma Trim. Thanks be to God. Vivian Thompson. Thanks be to God. Ed Aiken. Thanks be to God. Nancy Bright. Thanks be to God. Keith Lottridge. Thanks be to God.
Chris Wright. Thanks
be to God. Ernie Johnson. Thanks be to God.
F.D. Hewitt.
Thanks be to God. Marion Hewitt. Thanks be to God.
Mary Moody.
Thanks be to God. Marie Upton. Thanks be to God.
Sherry Deritho.
Thanks be to God. Abby Jones. Thanks be to God.
Jerry Ballard.
Thanks be to God.
Jim Cummings.
Thanks be to God.
Marianne Isbell.
Thanks be to God.
Snooky Schrader.
Thanks be to God.
Kit Robbins.
Thanks be to God.
Sue Thayer.
Thanks be to God.
Janice Serio.
Thanks be to God.
Owen Caston Ray.
Thanks be to God.
Lula Zell Ray.
Thanks be to God.
James Houston.
Thanks be to God.
James Bruce Leslie.
Thanks be to God.